Hello. This one really works. Thank you everyone for being here. And yeah, this is really exciting to be doing this with Zak. And I actually just finished this film looking at young Chinese students, and I feel like Zak, well, you finished school a few years ago, but you still recently studied, I would say, I guess in 2012 when I started working on my film, as I filmed Mainland from 2012 to 15. That was during the period of time when you just graduated. And I know, in the last number of years, Columbia has a large group of, always significant numbers of Chinese students, because every time I've been on that campus, I just see groups of Chinese students visiting the campus, and it's one of the top schools that a lot of Chinese students would love to go attend. And so, yeah, I guess I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about what that experience was like, having, I think at that time, a little bit less than half of the student body being Chinese, international student body, and now maybe even more, right? And I imagine you encountered and maybe made friends with some of the Chinese students in your class, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that experience was like, and if that had any influence on you wanting to write a book about this.
Absolutely. Well, first, is this?
Should be.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Just keep talking.
Okay, perfect. So first, I just, if you don't mind, I want to set the stage a little bit. I just saw Miao's film the other night, and it's excellent. And so it is a distinct honor to be sharing the stage with you, and I want to thank everyone here for coming. I've been a fan of the China Institute. I actually been in your place more times than not, so I'm really honored that you guys would come today. In terms of my background, I did go to Columbia. My first semester, so I'm from California, a small suburb. I went to public school, and my first semester at Columbia, I took a Chinese class. And to this day, it remains my worst grade throughout my entire academic career. No problem.
Go ahead.
So I loathed Chinese more than just about any other subject I've ever taken. I skipped for 2 months expecting that I would drop. I once gave a tour of Columbia to a student who was considering for my high school back home, and pointed to the window on the second floor, and I said, I think about leaving through that window often, and I just couldn't cut it. But years later, when I was deciding where to study abroad, I just mentioned this to Dinda as well, I was a big science fiction fan, still am, and was deciding where I could go. I figured I could go to Europe and study history, study the past, music, architecture, literature, the foundations of our government here. Or I could go to Hong Kong and see where everyone was saying the future was happening. When you set it up like that, it's a fairly easy decision. And there's no doubt that my coming from the Bay Area, where we have a large Asian and Asian American population, and then spending time at Columbia, which takes more Chinese students, I think, than any other Ivy League school at all. And undoubtedly informed my curiosity with China. But what convinced me to go back after I graduated, when I came back from Hong Kong, I felt pretty pointedly that the China that I had experienced there, the people I talked to, particularly the young people, were far different than the China that had been described to me in media, and then even reverberating off of the people who go for a week or two in Shanghai and come out with this, far-reaching understanding of what China is. I wanted to understand how this young China, as I began to understand it, which is not just young people, but also an emerging Chinese identity, was different than the China that most of us understood. And what mechanisms could I develop to help understand those better? To fast forward up to now, the company that I did start, it's a think tank and a consultancy. The consultancy funds the think tank. And it's more or less continuing the work that I tried to start with the book, which is figuring out different mechanisms to understand this young generation that are different than the news and different than just looking at pure consumer behavior, but really trying to get at the why. Why is this young generation a certain way? How is it that they see the world? How is it different than the way that millennials see the world in the United States? And that question has kept me fairly addicted to China for all these years.
So, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about what was your understanding of China before you went to China? And, you know, what were some of the first things that you saw and witnessed and encountered that really started to change that idea?
So before I went to China, I had watched a lot of Bruce Lee films growing up. You know, my mechanisms for understanding China were those of a fairly sheltered kid in a California suburb, honestly. I knew what I saw in the news, which is typically a sort of extraordinary version of China. You get this really scintillating sort of, here's the dog-eating festival, because there's a tradition of poverty in China, but here's this Maserati driving guy driving to the dog-eating festival. And everyone lives in ghost towns because they're building outside of these city hubs, but no one's actually moving to cities. But people also have to be shoved onto subways because of overpopulation. And it's this scintillating, often contradictory view of China that ultimately leaves you sort of scared. It sounds scary. The first chapter in my book is called Organ-Stealing Prostitutes and the Other Walls Between China and the World. And it describes a story how even from Hong Kong, China looks scary. Mainland China looks like, among other things, like they have a lot of organ-stealing prostitutes. So rather than focusing on the extraordinary, what I really wanted to do in the book and through, honestly, what I continue to really want to do, is to focus on the ordinary. Rather than the news pieces that will drive clicks, I'm more interested in the sort of decisions and the constellation of considerations that a young person would have in a first-tier city like Beijing and Shanghai, but then in a second and third and fourth-tier city that most of us won't even have heard of, but still drive the majority of China rather than just the extraordinary edges of the Chinese population. So when I first went there, I assumed it would be terrifying, and everyone sort of told me it would be. And when I went, I found it to be almost shockingly human. Trying to access that humanity that became my goal.
That's a bit of a shared goal that we have. I feel like it's just a tiny bit about my background. I actually grew up in China, and I moved to the US when I was 12, and didn't speak any English when I moved here, and I had to completely understand this culture in America, and now this is really, I mean, New York, I would say, is more my home than anywhere else at this point. But just like, you know, what you're saying, I spent, you know, the last almost 20, 30 years now that I've spent in the US, I feel like all the news I hear and just everything you hear, that you know, the average, even for someone, not to just say the average American, but even for someone who is maybe more interested in China, you know, like people like you who are attending an event like this, it's still really hard to get information or to understand without, let's say, having been to China. You know, that's really the one way to really know what it's like. But there was just such a lack of information about ordinary people. You know, China's not, it's such a large country, but it's not just about the government. It's not just, it's just not all the extreme cases that you hear in the news. So that was always one of my goals as well as a filmmaker. Making films about China is to show the lives of ordinary people. So when I was reading your book, I felt like there's definitely a kinship there that it's really only through hearing about the lives of just young people and ordinary people, what their aspirations are, that you can kind of start to get a picture and to humanize the giant, you know, but first you're looking at really just the billions of people not understanding anything, but through looking at a few people's lives, you really can start to relate.
Right, and one of the things that I try to emphasize to people is that sense of identity really matters. So how people see themselves, how they see the world, the narratives that drive the forming identity of this young generation impact you, all of you actually, directly. You know, if China seems really academic and fairly distant, but once you start considering who's buying the land in your part of Park Slope, or who you're competing with to get into Columbia, who your child will be competing with, to get into Columbia? Why is it that when you go and see a movie, there are new aspects of Shanghai and Beijing being incorporated because a movie can't be made without a second showing in China now? It just won't be funded. How China is developing and this massively impactful young generation, how they see themselves is actually going to impact everyone here directly. So taking an interest in a sense of self beyond just news, beyond just titles, and then trying to understand, trying to step away from where I sit in the world. There's a great line on the Chinese internet that was really popular. I spend too much time on the internet. And one of the sayings is, 屁股决定脑袋. It means your butt determines your brain. Getting some laughs here, that means someone knows what I'm talking about. Your butt determines your brain sounds like a really coarse way to describe a sociological phenomenon. But the idea is that where you sit in the world, your view of other people, your background, where you're from, where you grew up, who's talking to you as you're growing up, it informs your sense of self and your understanding of the world to a far greater degree than we'd even like to admit. I like to think I'm this autonomous thinker who can go out in the world and form free opinions, but no, people contend in China that it's really where you sit in the world that informs to a large degree your understanding of it. And so for a moment, trying to take ourselves out of our seat and put it into a young person's in China. Trying to understand the way that the world looks if your per capita GDP has increased not 2.5 times in the last 28 years like it has in the United States, but 25 times. What would it look like if you remember when your parents were denied passports to go abroad because people considered them to be economic refugees? And now everyone and their mothers in the travel industry is bending over backwards trying to figure out how to get tourism to their country or their hotel. How that changes the way you understand others, how that changes the way you understand the US, and how that changes the way you understand yourselves as a Chinese person. That has enormous impact across the board and really personal impact.
Something I wanted to ask about just through your experiences and writing this book as well and the people encountered. So you're talking about their identity and how they see themselves. What are some of the ways that, the young, well, maybe first tell us, because not everybody understands the post-90s, those, because that's how the Chinese kind of define the different generations, which is a little bit different from the millennials kind of categorizing. But you can tell us a little bit about that, and then just what you think, the identity or how like the post-90s generation see themselves versus someone from the 80s or the 70s.
Absolutely, and this is going to be from the title of tonight's program, the Strawberry Generation. So the way China understands demography is a little bit different. In the United States, we have millennials. Everyone's trying to figure out, I'm a millennial, what do we stand for, what are we loyal to, what do we want to buy? China, I had to look up the word for millennials in Chinese recently because I've never heard it in China. It's 千禧一代, but I literally never heard it in my life. The way that China understands itself, this is sort of like a good first opportunity to, instead of using a Western model to try to fit China in, understanding the Chinese model and letting that inform your understanding of them. So in China, they have born after 80s, born after 90s, born after thousands.
Yeah.
I don't know how I would say that.
Right.
They do it on the decade instead of by 20 years. So millennials typically is 1982 through 2004, depending on who you ask. It's a made-up frame. I think Generation Z, who comes afterwards, starts in 1996, so it's a lot of overlap. It's a fictional thing that marketers use, but it sort of informs the way we see the world. China has something entirely different. The born after 90 generation, which is my generation, I'm born in 1990, the born after 90 generation in China is so significant for a variety of reasons. First, they're born after Tiananmen Square, and so the narrative that was told to them in terms of their history had shifted from the generations before them. National education in China used to focus on Mao. It used to focus on the incredible, so-called incredible accomplishments of Mao and the Cultural Revolution and how China had been unified. And it was largely a fiction, not entirely, but to a greater extent than they would discuss in their history programs. After 1989, the entire education program switched. And so China started to focus on its historical significance. For over 1,000 years, China was the wealthiest empire on earth. Over the last 200 years, they've experienced major setbacks. They commemorate something called the 100 years of humiliation. And so they're developing a narrative. If you're born in this 1990s generation, you have this narrative of we were once great, and then we fell to our knees. How do we become great again? That's a much different way of viewing the world than even millennials in the United States. On top of that, they have seen incredible change in their lifetime, capitalism. Isn't it ironic that the world's largest communist party has created the largest capitalist success in the history of economics? This young generation has watched their country change before their eyes. When they were young, they remember their parents, again, not being able to get passports. They remember bicycles flooding the streets. Now China is already the largest luxury car market in the world. They have this understanding of the world that's informed by change at a pace that is greater and larger and faster than any other generation in history. And that makes them, there's a certain amount of exceptionalism that comes from that. With your work, Miao, there's an enormous amount of study abroad students coming to the United States who are experiencing firsthand the United States. And interestingly enough, and we should talk about this because I think it's important, increased exposure to the United States and the rest of the world has not necessarily led to more admiration for other systems instead of their own. By the I'll believe it when I see it metric, that the things that are happening before my eyes, there must be some validity to them. This young generation has a tremendous amount of belief in their country and their system. Is it flawed? Absolutely. But from where they sit in the world, right? Their view has validity too, and understanding why it's perceived to be valid is, again, very important for us.
I'm curious actually how many people born in the 90s that you've encountered know anything about, Tiananmen Square, what happened in 1989? Because I think part of the reason why I feel like at least the Chinese categorize almost like by the decade, well, so much happened in a decade, everything is moving so fast, so it's not like you can't wait 20 years. By 20 years, it's already a different era in China. So I'm born after the 70s, and I think and I recently noticed that a lot of filmmakers, actually independent filmmakers, most of them male, but I've noticed that a lot of them in China are born after the 70s. And I was sort of trying to, I just recently thought of that, and I was trying to understand why that might be. And I feel like part of it is that, I'm the generation that kind of actually lived through the Tiananmen Square. And I was still fairly young when that happened, but I was actually in Beijing, and all these people around me, my cousin, my brother, everybody actually went to Tiananmen Square because we, lived not far, and everyone, every young person at that time went there because it was just, you went there to hang out, before everything went down. But and then in the recent years, even in the U.S., I've actually encountered many people that, especially don't live in Beijing or are from more southern city like Shenzhen. Like there was someone that works in a laundromat down the street, near Greenpoint. One time, he actually just asked me, after I came back from China recently. Before that, he asked me, so. The Tiananmen Square actually happened, and he was actually not even, that young. He was probably like similar to my age, maybe. And I was really shocked actually, because I never really thought that was like just the fact that it existed was questioned. But I'm curious how many, because I do feel like, in my film too, you'll see the boy who was born, like he's like 18, 19, he actually did a project about Tiananmen Square. And I think for most students that come to study in the US, Chinese students, that's something that everybody encounters, right? It's sort of like the first thing an American would want to ask a Chinese person, because that's the most well-known thing. And then there's always this moment for a young Chinese person to kind of have to face that when they come to the U.S. And so I'm curious, like, did you ever have those kind of conversations, and what came out of it?
Before I answer that question, how many Chinese speakers are there here?
Yeah.
You can raise your hand. So for those of us who aren't, actually, that's a very happy fortune. Chinese is tonal, obviously, and the way you say generational rift in China is daigou, means there's like a generational chasm. But if you say daigou, it means someone who is in a different country buying stuff for you. So paying attention to these tones is really important. Tiananmen Square. So we almost call this talk tonight anything but government, because I end up having to talk about government more than I like, because I do think it's one part of an identity of this young generation. I have one chapter on Code 12. And so I hope we start talking at some point, and you guys can ask questions about this if we end up talking about government, because it is such an interesting question, but like sex and drugs and music and movies, and so that's all fair game too. But Tiananmen, so I would stratify this into different types of education. One of the more interesting things that I did was I compared history books from Taiwan, Hong Kong, mainland China, and different parts of mainland China, then of course the United States, for high school history books. What's so interesting about a Taiwanese history primer is that it's technically illegal in China, so I had to smuggle it back. And in the 12th chapter, I described my roommate at the time. He was a cadre in training. He was someone who his greatest ambition was to be a mayor of a mid-level country, I say country here, and the reason why, a mid-level city in China of about 1 million people. So small country by most people's standards. But those were his ambitions. So he was deeply in tune with the party line. We lived together for 6 months and debated just about everything. We compared these two histories, particularly Taiwan and mainland. And the biggest difference in history, and history is so important because, like what Carl Jung says, it's the stories we tell ourselves much more than the actual facts of our lives that inform the way we see ourselves. So each of our stories, like if you were to ask someone about the Thanksgiving story in the United States, depends on who you ask, they could be two very different stories. In China, Tiananmen Square is discussed in a variety of different ways. Taiwan, of course, spends about 2.5 pages on Tiananmen Square, goes into relatively deep detail. The Chinese textbook spends about 2 paragraphs. Didn't ignore it, understated, absolutely, and that tends to be most people's impression of it.
Right.
So everyone I talked to knew what Tiananmen Square was. It wasn't the question I asked everyone, but it came up. What's the most interesting that I thought was that, similar to a lot of what's going on in China, which is questioning Western narratives about China, there's a lot of people who believe that our version of Tiananmen Square is overstated dramatically. And again, this is not my personal opinion, but there's a variety of people who bring up alternative sources that, on the surface at least, appear to have some validity about the number of people involved, about the degree of protests. At the time, for instance, Beijing police didn't carry guns, and so the military had to come in. The military was poorly trained. Again, I'm regurgitating this theory that people espoused in China, and that is in part, China's outdated gun laws is what led to this entire thing, but it wasn't nearly as big a deal. I think the best metric for how seriously the government takes it is that their entire education system changed after that. So there's an awareness of government in China, but the phrase I use most often to describe young people's relationship with the government is heaven is high and Beijing, the emperor is far away. What is it? Tiangao Huangdiyuan, right? I said that wrong for years. I said Shangao Huangdiyuan. It means the hills are high and the emperor is far away. I actually think that sounds better, but I don't get to make Chinese idioms. And it's that people don't feel involved with the Chinese government. It's that they know it exists, but they treat it like the weather. They can talk about it, they can prepare for it, they can complain about it, but they can't change it. So figuring out how you exist within it is the most important thing.
Yeah, that's definitely always how I feel like my encounters with most Chinese these days, well, especially younger people. I feel like really younger people, which is probably what I was talking about, the slightly older generation, I think are more, maybe they're just more bitter, because they kind of know a little bit of experience and went
Imagine being in
through.
your teens when Tiananmen was at.
Yeah.
Versus it being described secondhand.
Right.
It's an entirely different experience.
Yeah, yeah. But I've had many really interesting conversations too, because I have, this one girl I work with, she's in her 20s and she works in film, and she helps us out a lot of times when I go back to Shanghai, and she's, she speaks English and consumes not only Western culture, but also, a lot of films and a lot of kind of like art house films, and not even just like the Hollywood presentation of the world, but literature and all kinds of, so like I considered her as this very well kind of, like
Cosmopolitan.
Yeah, cosmopolitan culture. And then one day, when we were coming back from a film screening, we got stuck on a train for a while, and somehow started this conversation. I think it got started because I realized she was a Communist Party member, and I was like, wow, I don't think I've ever actually really met that many people who are Communist Party members. What is that like? What do you do? So the conversation went on, and the further I dug, the more I realized how much she loves the Communist Party, and how she really actually adores Xi Jinping, and all of that kind of shocked me a lot. I don't know, I think maybe somehow the image of this person being fairly, I kind of almost equated a little bit of that level of understanding, consuming that kind of level of culture with maybe having more exposure also to certain Western ideas of democracy or freedom. And I know you write about this a little bit in your book, so maybe tell us also about what you've encountered, people's idea of being free and how that differs than our idea.
Freedom, there's two words I encountered all the time in China. First is freedom, and the second one is pressure. They're related. Freedom I saw tattooed on people's wrists, woven into their leather jackets. I had a friend who had the word freedom written on the ceiling above his bed, so that it was the first thing he saw every morning and the last thing he saw every night. Freedom is absolutely deeply craved within China. But different than freedom from an oppressive, restrictive government, which is often what we imagine, it's more often freedom from an oppressive, restrictive set of traditions. Which is different than what a lot of us imagine. And it's sort of difficult to swallow at first, but I sort of describe this young generation in China as being between two large tectonic plates. On one end, you have tradition, what it's always meant to be Chinese, right? And this new understanding of history, China is 5,000 years old, not 1949, when Mao founded the People's Republic of China. It's long, and Confucianism, forming a family, marriage, being sheltered, being filially pious, being a good son or daughter. What it means to be Chinese, that's on one side. And on the other side, you have the pressures of modernity. Getting a job, getting educated, traveling abroad, buying things, wanting stuff. This is the first generation that instead of worrying about subsistence questions, what am I going to eat? How am I going to provide shelter for my family? Remember, in 1990, China's per capita GDP was around $330. China was deeply poor in my generation's lifetime. Now this generation, instead of asking subsistence questions, they could ask identity questions, which is an entirely different set of considerations. This generation gets to define what it means to be Chinese in the modern world. But the conflict of tradition and modernity often leaves them in bind. I can give you 2 examples. So first is with women, broadly speaking. But this is important. So Shengyu and the issue of leftover women gets a lot of ink in the West, and I think it's important that it does. I think it's emblematic of this conflict between tradition and modernity. So leftover women is the idea that if you are an unmarried woman by the age of 27, now it's being pushed back to 30 in first and sometimes second tier cities, then you are considered socially inedible, that you are the leftovers. Kind of tough to swallow in New York, right? I mean, it feels like everyone, there's not a lot of people I know who are getting married under 30. But why is there that stigma? Well, there's this idea, and there's a recent book by Roseanne Lake that got written about this. Lita Hong Fincher wrote an exceptional book on this several years ago. And there's this idea that what it means to be a good person is to form a family if you're a woman. So if you don't form a family, then you haven't fulfilled what it means to be a good person. Really, it's like that basic, good with a capital G. And it used to be that you didn't have to get an education in order to get ahead. So you'd graduate, people would get married when they were 18, and that was sort of it. But now, in order to survive in modern China, you don't just need a college degree. China graduates 7.5 million college graduates every year. You also probably need a professional degree to get ahead. And you're also not supposed to date, by the way. It used to be that losing your virginity before marriage was considered a cultural sin. China doesn't have religion, but it does have family. So you're supposed to get a professional degree. You're not really supposed to date before you get married, but when are you going to get married before you have your professional degree? So people are graduating at 25, and then they have 2 years to figure out their entire dating life and get married before they're considered socially inedible. It's a very tight time frame. People are pushing back against that, not just in terms of when they're starting to have sex, but in terms of what it means to be a good person. This idea of a leftover woman, that if I'm going to be pursuing my goals in career as I've been told my whole life, that I'm not then faulted for not being married on your illogical confusion timescale. That's one example. Second example is with men. In China, to be considered an eligible bachelor, you have to own property. It's this idea of anchuangan, this idea of a sense of security, being able to provide a sense of security for somebody. In China's roiling, fast-moving economy, land is something you could hold, something that is difficult to take away. Difficult, not impossible. And
Well, it's not 7 years.
right, it's 77 years, or is it 70 years? So you're basically leasing the land, but it still is more solid than most of the stuff. So if you're a young person in China, if you're a young man in China, you have to have an apartment in order to get married. You're not considered a good person unless you're married. This is later in life. But you're also not considered a good person unless you're a good son. So there's this idea that I just said of filial piety, being able to take care of your parents. That's the definition of good, capital G in China. But because you need an apartment, most young men are now having to ask their parents for money in order to buy an apartment. It's called parent eaters. It's called parenting. There's a chapter on this. So they want to be good people, and in order to be good people, they feel like they have to form a family. These young men, my friends, feel like they have to form a family, but also they have to be eating their parents financially in order to get that done. And so any way you cut it, they end up a bad person. Again, locked, grinding between those two tectonic plates, that sense of tradition, what it means to be a good person, and has for centuries in China. And then these pressures of modernity. I mean, anyone trying to buy an apartment in a first or second tier city right now, in China, it's ugly. And when you consider that average wages are still around $500 a month, $600 a month, it's unlikely, but people do it.
I actually don't know how people do it. But I mean, apartment prices in Beijing and Shanghai are literally higher than New York. And I have no idea how people really can afford it. But I do think a lot of the times the parents, and I think really the only way people can afford buying apartments in Beijing and Shanghai, the top tier cities in China, often is when the parents have lived in that city, right? And then they already had in the house, had an apartment that they could pass on to their children. But it's really, really difficult for anybody coming from and not growing up in that city to actually move there and to purchase an apartment that's like $1 million or more. I'm actually, very curious about the whole, and this is something, I don't necessarily know that there is an answer, but because I haven't encountered quite an answer to this, and I'm sure most of the Chinese are trying to figure that out themselves, but that kind of contradiction and that push and pull of modernity and all the consumption of Western culture that, Chinese consume so much more about, know so much more about what's going on in the West and in America than any American, more by far, knows about China. And so, and like, for instance, in my film, Mainland, but it's funny, right, because the girl who decides to come to study in the US, she based that off of High School Musical, the film, the Disney movie. This is what she saw as an American high school life, and she was like, this is what I want. And something totally different from China, because in China you're not allowed to date when you're in high school, and parents literally will like pull you apart, teachers will pull you apart, and she's looking forward to going to high school dance. But then, they come and so, but at the same time, there's of course, all these other pressures in their life. Like, she would probably, like, for instance, Stella in my film, she would love to maybe just open a coffee shop or be an artist, even though her dad owns a factory and is quite wealthy. But there's still this sense of insecurity, and that I found really fascinating, and how, just how do young people kind of reconcile that, and to kind of reconcile this desire for modernity and for this more kind of progressive way of life, but at the same time, they are pulled back in many ways. And for women too, there are many, I think a lot of women, especially in cities now, in Beijing and Shanghai, there are a lot of women who are so-called leftover. And I actually hate that term, and I don't even want to say it, because I just feel like it was created to, it was basically created by the Chinese government, so I feel like every time someone says it, it's perpetuating it. But anyhow, just that idea, but I think a lot of the women are actually trying, I think like a lot of things in China, people try to find, there's so many restrictions and there's so many things that make it difficult for them to do certain things, but people find ways within the system and within the confined restrictions. So I guess tell us a little bit about what are maybe some stories of people and how do they, maybe there's an example of a woman trying, how does she kind of wrestle with that, and what do what are some of the other ways?
So with gender in China, I often say China is pragmatic, not progressive. There's this line quoted with Miao all the time that women hold up half the sky. What was so interesting about the era of Miao is that everyone became a tongzhi, everyone became a comrade. And tongzhi means someone of the same ambition. And Mao was a man of great ambition, and he needed his entire population to be working in order to achieve that ambition. And so if he didn't mobilize half of the population, there was no chance that he could unify or begin to unify the country and achieve his ambitions. That wasn't based on this progressive idea of women being equal to men, honestly, it was not. But pragmatism drove him to mobilize both sides of the gender spectrum. Today it's something similar. China still is inhibited by a variety of different stigmas around what women ought to be, what men ought to be as well. Women far more, honestly. This idea of leftover women, it's a really awful term, and it was actually created by the Women's Federation a small segment from within the government. I mentioned Lita Hong Fincher earlier. What was so amazing about her research was she discovered this. She traced this back to early pamphlets. This was the etymology of the term was actually, I think, 2007. It's not like this traditional Chinese thing. It's just, it was 11 years ago they created the idea. I think one good example is the example of Bella. So Bella's in chapter 2 of my book, and a good friend of mine, I actually spoke at her wedding recently, and so this might be a good tie-in. And Bella, I met Bella in the library. Bella spent, I think, 80 hours a week in the library. She was there when it opened every day, and she left when it closed every night, throughout all of the seasons. And so as, depending on what Bella was wearing that day, I could guess, it was an easy way to track the passage of time. And I watched Bella for 9 months, day after day, bust her tail in order to get into a school. And what I didn't write into the book is that Bella was sneaking around and dating someone without telling me. So I saw Bella almost, I would say, once a week for an entire year. I would go visit her in the library, I would pretend to study or try to study, and we would get lunch or something like that. And throughout the entire experience, she was a 22-year-old woman, by the way. She had bought an iPad, which for her was an immense reach financially. She lived in a dorm with 5 other women. There was no shower or hot water in the dorm. They would boil water and put it into a tub in order to wash their hair during winter. And Bella had this boyfriend that she hadn't told me, but she had, and we're being filmed, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but she had been in this relationship for a period of time without telling anyone, her parents included, because sex, the joke is that there's a phrase that's attributed to Miao. It's actually not from Miao, but dating without the purpose of marriage is hooliganism. This idea of hooliganism. So it used to actually be a crime to be anywhere in the LGBT category, and was seen as a mental disease in China. Not only a crime, but a mental disease. Other crimes under the Hooliganism Act were dancing to Western music, wearing hats, wearing a certain type of hat. Actually, the oldest and last hooligan in China, who was recently let out of prison, had been in for life for getting into a Western-style brawl, the Hooliganism Act. And so Bella, while she was studying, she had to keep her relationship secret from her parents, but also secret from me, because she thought that I might judge her, because she thought that any relationship that she were to have would detract from her ability to get into her dream translation program. She was actually studying for grad school. What's so interesting about Bella is she's someone who worked incredibly hard, was someone who had her own way of seeing the world. She was nearly fluent in English. She had grown up watching, How I Met Your Mother, Friends. There's this idea that China is behind this wall of censorship, but they have a tremendous awareness of the world. You mentioned this earlier, Miao. There's in terms of the understanding disparity, there are 300 million English speakers in China, mostly young. My peers in China have studied about 10 years of English.
Yes, now we started studying English from first grade.
Exactly. There are 1 million Chinese speakers in the United States. So if language is the first step to understanding, the level of understanding, or the ratio is about 300 to 1, US to China, China to US. There's this idea that they grew up behind a wall, that they don't know what dating ought to be like, or what it could look like, what democracy could be like, or how it could play out. That's just not true. It's just not. And so Bella kind of knew what dating was like, and she had this idea of love, which, when everyone was being comrades, that was not in the vocabulary. And she slowly dated this man. They ended up moving to the same city after school. She did not get into the program. Studied 80 hours a week for an entire year, was off by 3 points. 3 out of 800 people got in. Those are the odds of success in most institutions in China. Those were actually relatively forgiving. But what Bella told me, and I think I often joke that if China were to have like a sitcom made about the last 65 years or 68 years of roiling movement forward, the catchphrase at the end of it would be, 计划赶不上变化. It's this what everyone says when things don't go right. It means the plans can't keep up with the changes. China changes so fast that, you know, moving from a first-tier city 30 minutes out is more like time travel than physical travel. You're seeing what China looked like 20 years ago, not what the neighboring town, suburb looks like. It's a different experience. Bella recognizes that she can have ideas of the old world, ideas of her parents, ideas of what it means to date, what it means to be a good daughter, mixed with the new. There's this intermingling of times and concepts of what it means to be a person in the modern world that you don't really get anywhere else in the world because China moves so fast. I have one statistic that I kind of like. I don't know if anyone else is going to like it, and feel free to cut me off. And I do want to make sure to have time for questions, by the way. I mentioned that per capita GDP, I think per capita GDP is a decent metric for just what like a basic life, what you get with a basic life in a place. It's not perfect. I said the United States in my lifetime, our per capita GDP has increased 2.5 times. So what does that mean? That means my family, my neighbors, the cars that they drive, the jobs that they have, maybe the amount of disposable income, what they're able to afford, has increased 2.5 times in my lifetime, which is pretty exceptional for a developed country. My peer in China have watched their country, their family, themselves, their job prospects, their per capita GDP increase 25 times, order of magnitude. And maybe that's just a developing country thing. What about the other BRICS nations? India, who has a similarly large population. There are 400 million Chinese millennials, by the way. 80 million in the United States, 400 million in China, so a big cohort. India, which has a similar population, similar emphasis on innovation, similar emphasis on education and family, their per capita GDP has increased less than 5 times in that same period of time, less than 5. In fact, if you look at all countries over that same period of time, there is only one country that has outperformed China, it is Equatorial Guinea. And if everyone in this room went to Equatorial Guinea for the weekend, we could probably change their per capita GDP. It is that small of a country. What China has achieved is so historically unique, and the pace of change they've been able to achieve it at means that someone like Bella and someone like Tom, the government cadre I talked about, who has a fairly strong opinion of his government, they can understand the old and new in a way that we simply cannot grasp because they've lived in both. When my friend's Tom's parents were born, it was 1969. Or excuse me, they were coming of age, it was 1969. In 1969, my parents were deciding whether or not to go to Woodstock. Think about what kind of goes along with that, like your attitude of drugs, sex, probably have a car, or know someone with a car, and grow your hair long without getting yelled at. My friend's parents, Tom's parents, who I know quite well, were in the field during the Cultural Revolution, fighting off starvation. That's what a generation gap looks like in China.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of lived a little bit, not to the extreme, but when I grew up, I remember my mom going every morning at like 3 a.m. Well, not every morning, maybe once a month, I think, going at 3 a.m. with a little stool to wait in line to get the monthly ration of meat, you know. So, and I've every time I've gone back to China in the last 20, 30 years, you can't even grasp how much has changed. Because now, you know, you go to China, there's just really expensive, fancy restaurants everywhere, and people have banquets the size of, you know, this room. It's really just shocking. But yeah, I guess tell us a little bit about the title of your book, Restless Generation. Why did you name them the Restless Generation? And what are some of the biggest worries, you know, this generation has?
And I want this to be our last question so we can open up to questions from the audience. Does that sound good? Okay, good. Now we got some questions lined up. So the name in the title of tonight's program, the Strawberry Generation, is important because it helps draw into relief the difference between the old generation in China and the young generation in China, old and young China. The most defining characteristic that people cite all the time with the older generation in China is their ability to to eat bitter. Eat bitter means the ability to do difficult things for long periods of time at the prospect of delayed gratification. Delayed not necessarily for a month, and you know, we work hard and And if we get a good grade, then we get, our parents buy us something. That's one type of delayed gratification. But maybe for a decade or maybe entire generations, I'm going to work hard and eat bitter so my kids can live better. The older generation was defined by that. It was actually on the shoulders of that mentality, plus this enormous baby boomer generation in China. Between 1949 and 1979 in China, there were 440 million people added to the population. Those are the people who built the manufacturing economy that we imagine when we think of China, plus the ability to eat bitter. This young generation is sometimes called the strawberry generation for their inability to eat bitter, for their proclivity towards the sweet and enjoyable things of life. I often say, especially compared to millennials, by the way, they can whip our butts in terms of grit and the ability to eat bitter in the West, but there's this want to 活在当下, to live in the moment, or there's an older way of saying, this is one of my favorite idioms, it's 今朝有酒,今朝醉. It means today we have booze, so today we drink. It's this idea that we enjoy what we have now. It's sort of an ancient way of saying YOLO. And you only live once, and I just dig that. But they're known as, I think of them as the Restless generation, because I don't think it's as simple as all that. And a lot of it has to do with this idea of identity formation. I think of China's identity right now as sort of being in the teens. It's a young nation who is becoming acquainted with the world really for the first time as a modern nation. And as such, you guys remember what it was like to be a teen. It was not always that great. You have this tremendous sense of pride in China now, watching your country grow and become strong, become recognized in ways that the older generation in China could never have imagined. You watch people telling you that your system of governance is incorrect, and then watching how that jives with your understanding of your government and what you've seen with your entire life. But it's not just on a macro scale. You're worried about, in the fast pace of China's changing economy and world and the torpor and the churn of what life is like in Beijing or Shanghai, how do I provide for myself? How do I make a spot for myself in this world? This young generation in China is also known as the Me generation, not dissimilar from millennials in the United States. And figuring out how to derive a sense of self in cities that do an extremely good job of squashing that. If anyone has been on a Beijing subway at 8 in the morning, it's difficult to feel like an individual. It really is. And amidst that turmoil, trying to find a sense of self, a sense of purpose, a sense of identity is a challenge. And so on one hand, people are extremely excited by the amount of opportunity that feels like it's in the air in Beijing, amongst other things. And all throughout China, not just Beijing, but I spent most of my time in second-tier cities. I tried to avoid Beijing and Shanghai. But Chengdu, Chongqing, even up north, in cities that aren't performing quite as well, there's this sense that you can do greater things than even that you can do in the United States. There's that sense that opportunity abounds. But with that, there's also the apprehension that maybe it won't touch you. And with that comes a restlessness. Should we open it up to the audience? Thank you so much. This was, thank you guys for sitting patiently. So Dina, how does this work?
I think go ahead and just choose people who want to ask questions. But please identify yourselves first, if you don't mind. Yep.
Okay. My name's Peter Crosby. I'm making a documentary film in China. And one of my subjects is a man born in 1990 who got his girlfriend pregnant. They live in Hubei, fifth-tier city. And they've decided to keep the baby. So there's a lot of ramifications for them. Can you tell me about some of the ramifications? They're also part of the Tucha minority,
Right.
which sort of doubles down on.
Sure. So one of the more interesting things about China, and I said this in terms of the importance of forming a family, I have encountered a large number of people who've gotten pregnant before they got married. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, people are usually pretty excited because it means, if you watch Chinese, I was saying this to Dinda earlier, that I watch an upsetting amount of Chinese TV. And in a lot of these sitcoms, there's always these quirky relationships, and the quirky relationships aren't about the two individuals in the relationship, it's more about how their parents are interfering in them. There's this tremendous want to like hold your grandson. That's the trope. I just want to hold my grandson. And so pregnancy, as long as it's followed by marriage, is generally not looked down upon to the degree that it is here in the United States, in China, because of the importance of the next generation. Being a minority culture in China is its own set of complications. China is 95% Han Chinese. I lived in Chengdu, a place where there is far more minority cultures there, and I've traveled throughout fairly extensively into all the provinces at this point. And there is very much a minority rules mentality in China. People do things and the government supports things that will lead to majority success. But the idea of minority rights has not permeated throughout China much at all. In terms of family planning, though, the exception to the one-child policy was most often minorities in China. This was actually a big reason why they ended up stopping. The Chinese government pays an enormous amount of attention to the quality of its population. This is actually the word people use in official government documents, sort of eugenics argument. The idea that people in poorer places with less education were able to have more children began to worry the government 30 years on. And this also plays into the leftover woman thing, because typically the women who were not having children were those who were more career-oriented, who had the best education, who had the most amount of resources, CEOs,
Yeah.
who the Chinese government, from a sort of, to some upsetting eugenics point of view, wanted to repopulate the nation, and these were the people they wanted to have kids, who wanted to be going through tutoring. So there's a basket of considerations, but this idea that having children before marriage is terrible, it doesn't exist to the extent that it does here in China.
So, Gary Burzak, independent question. The last generation, the one child, left us at a time in China where there were 30 men to women in certain areas, right? That is from the 70s.
I haven't seen that particular statistic.
Not in a major, but some areas, and I saw about 10 years this documentary of these lost men who work in the factories and everything, and they're unseen. But the demographics, I think I'm hearing in the main cities is still a kind of equal, or is there more women than men?
There's more single women.
Yeah. Well, this is the irony of the leftover women thing, is that there's actually far more leftover men than leftover women. So there's about 30 million, depending on who you ask, 30 to 40 million gender split in China, of people of marriageable age. And because China is still very realistic, is the euphemism people use around marriage, it means that these unmarried men are most likely the least educated and the poorest remunerated, so just the poorest, which there are very few things in a society that create more volatility than unmarried men, honestly. There is a tremendous amount of Chinese literature on this, studying cultures all across the world.
Well, or in the U.S.
Or in the U.S., honestly, you look at shootings, these are typically men who feel entitled to something.
Africa, the Middle East.
All over. There are very few more elements dangerous to society than unmarried guys. Honestly. Honestly, and particularly in a Confucian culture where your value comes from starting a family, the government has paid an enormous amount of attention to this. On one hand, they're using that, it used to be, again, in factories, now it's military fodder, which is its own sort of kind of science fiction concept, honestly. But these men, absolutely, if you go, I wanted to do a research trip to the border of Vietnam and China, because there are entire cities or towns erected there that are just kind of matchmaking cities, because ethnically often those country lines they're not totally arbitrary, but ethnicities don't abide by those borders, and so there are a lot of people who speak Chinese or a dialect of Chinese, and women from Vietnam, a developing very fast country, a country that's developing very fast, but still not nearly where China's at. They'll marry into China. So there are a variety of solutions for this that are being proposed, but it is absolutely a dangerous element within China.
Tremendous age. Some of these gentlemen are in their late 40s, 50s already?
Sure. So it is a large issue.
Yeah. Sorry, me?
Yeah.
Yeah, just to rephrase on that, so, for right
Can you
now-
identify yourself?
Oh, yeah, sorry, my name is Xu, and I kind of have a similar background, with Miao, came to the US when I was in elementary school, 5th grade, 6th grade, so it kind of grew up between two countries, kind of this, I can see it as an advantage at times, you kind of understand and can interact between two cultures. So rephrasing on what you just said about leftover men, do you think this is just a temporary, a time period frame that'll slowly go away, once China begins to overcome the basic needs of living standards, such as, right now, because a lot of people, they're still struggling for basic living. So maybe in a couple of decades from now, when the basic standard of living goes up, or China moves towards close to what we have here in the US, do you think the expectations for single men would slowly change to the way it is in the US? Would shifting towards, actually shifting to actually liking this person, or getting, seeing someone as someone that you enjoy being with, instead of, what they actually have to offer you, economic or material-wise. Do you think that's the trend that we're going to see in China in the next couple decades?
That's a great question, Shu. So part of what Shu was referencing was this, what I said, this realistic foundation for marriages, which is that you're not necessarily marrying for love, but you're marrying for what I brought up earlier, for a sense of security, be it financial or otherwise, most often financial. Marriage for love is just beginning to happen throughout China. Not just, in the last 5 or 10 years, I've heard about it far more, but the idea that you can watch TV and see it now, the idea that there are people that they're Beijing Love Story, one of the, it was a TV show that got turned into a movie, the idea that that could exist now, the idea that people could start going on dates and not clicking, the idea that you could not click with someone's personality was not something that people really cared about before. It's a new concept and it's important to this young generation. I think that's what's so, and again, I'm sorry for to come back to this leftover women concept and leftover men. Most leftover men are not in the position where the reason they're not marrying is not because they just haven't found that special someone yet. In some cases there are, and there's one person on my favorite TV show I can think of, whatever, that is that way, but in general it's a financial consideration. And men in general, I think in terms of the leftover men problem, it is the issue of uneducated, underfunded men that is so nerve-wracking for the government. But will there be men who are waiting longer to have children, waiting for that special someone to form a family? Absolutely. But this idea that the importance of a family will disintegrate in China, I don't believe that will be the case.
My name is Theo. I haven't read your book yet. I can't help noticing that when we talk about millennials, we really, in Western countries, we tend to talk about essentially people with a middle class background. And I don't know much about social sort of stratification in China, but how does this all fit together? How does, are those strawberry generation, are those people with essentially a middle class background, and how do maybe people, poor, wealthy, kind of do they self-identify in similar ways, or what?
Great question. So it used to be in China that regionality was the most important. China has 56 different dialects. That's a vast simplification. China actually has far more than that. And those were representative of the cultural risks and the isolation from place to place within China. So being from Sichuan versus being from Heilongjiang or something would actually be the biggest. There would be major cultural differences from place to place. Now, because of the internet, because of Mandarin, because of people moving all across the country, what matters most is first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and then tier city, and then rural. So those are typically representative of some sort of economic status. Shanghai, for instance, and what people are considering and what they're aware of, being able to get a hamburger, being able to see or know a Westerner. These are signs of cosmopolitanism that most of the places in China do not have. It's something I refer to honestly as the Shanghai fallacy, this idea that you go to Shanghai and think that's representative of China. It's actually
I'm in New York.
right, it's the least representative place in China. Even amongst growing cities, most cities are not going to develop in the way that Shanghai has. Shanghai was the first to get rich, and they mostly looked west. They're like, oh, that's how.
Well, Shanghai has also had a history of really looking to the West and always embraced the West.
Absolutely, and far more interaction with the West than any other place in China. So most places I went in China, I was the first foreigner that anyone had ever talked to. Just across the board. So the generation that I talk about in this book specifically, I try to focus on people in second-tier cities, Chengdu, Chongqing, Suzhou, developing places. So not on the upper cusp of developing China, but on sort of the aspirational middle cusp. I talk about some people, well, sort of the way I describe my experiences. I've been on the side of the road eating shaokao, eating barbecue, with a bunch of guys, honestly, who are working jobs that they don't love, trying to get enough money to buy an apartment to find something that they do love, watching a Maserati go past and then just being like, you know, ugh, just watching their entire face drop. I've also been in that Maserati with a wealthy friend who's, you know, four died, was second generation wealth, watching those people on the side of the street eating shaokao, eating barbecue, and watching his face drop being, you know, I remember when my life was that simple. So this whole identity search that's going on in China, I don't think is a luxury of just the upper class. I think many people in the emerging middle class in China are considering that too.
But is that identity, I mean, is there a similarity in the way those two classes identify themselves? Because I feel like it's such a big contrast, you know, from one end, the class difference in China, like the urban and the rural, just it's so vast that it actually, I feel like it's a big problem.
Enormous. So particularly from urban to rural. I did not write extensively about rural China in terms of where China wants to go, in terms of where China is heading. China is not moving towards a more rural economy. Of course, how China, you know, China has, what is it, 1/5 of the global population, but only 7% of the world's arable land. So food safety is one of China's biggest considerations. But this idea of like a farmer-peasant society, which China was, that's not where China is going. I have been to some of the more remote places, and I do write a little bit about Guizhou. But China's wealth disparity is, I think it's 0.49 Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality in the world. United States is 0.39. And it's really bad in China. People's experiences, particularly in rural places, different than a fifth-tier city even, is massively different. And I do not go into detail in that in the book.
Hi, my name is Jane. What is your impression of how they view the U.S.?
I love this question.
Yeah.
And I think your movie touches on this beautifully. Miao. So this generation has had more interaction with the US than any other. 2/3 of Chinese passport holders, people who own a passport in China, are under the age of 35. So it is millennials who are seeing the world throughout China. On top of that, they've grown up watching years of English TV, American TV, and understanding our history and learning about our government system. Honestly, China as a place of wanting to grow bigger, stronger, more powerful, took pains to study the United States as a model for that, what's been successful in the last 2 centuries. So their understanding of the United States is far more intimate and nuanced than even their parents. You know, I have friends who remember at the 1996 Olympics, their parents, they were only 6 years old, their parents telling them, look, this was in Atlanta. That's the most powerful country in the world, the United States. We have to study that. I think that year the United States won 48 gold medals, China won 15. It was a major coup for China at the time. But fast forward to 2008 and the Beijing Olympics, and an entire world has changed within China. That was China's coming out party. The opening of the Beijing Olympics was seen as the greatest show ever put on in the history of the human race. And it was not just telling the world, this is China. It was telling young people in China, this is the new China. That year, China won 51 gold medals, the United States won 36. And what's the value of a gold medal? Symbolically, it's not insubstantial. This young generation recognizes that the United States has a lot worth studying, but they no longer admire and seek to emulate everything in the United States, as even the older generation used to. Increased exposure through study abroad. 1 in 3 students in the United States right now studying abroad are from China. Increased exposure has not necessarily led to greater admiration. Often people see that there is a lot in their country that's worth holding on to, which is why I say this young generation is the generation that gets to decide what it looks like to be a modern Chinese person. What is the identity of modern China? It's cosmopolitan, it's a combination, but it doesn't mean, and this is actually, if there's one thing I ask people to sort of walk away with, I think most people believe that as a country modernizes, it westernizes. For China, this is a great example of how modernization does not necessarily mean westernization. As a country goes wealthier, we expect them to fall into our sphere of cultural, political, economic influence. China is saying, not just in the world of politics, in the world of economics and culture, that there's a lot that you guys do well, but we're not just going to give up our culture to become a wealthy, so-called wealthy nation in the 21st century.
I just wanted to quickly add a question to that. So also, as the subtitle of your book, like how do you think that will change the world?
Yeah.
This is the last question.
So my publisher chose that subtitle. I'm joking. So my book is called Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. There are some here, by the way, in case anyone wants some. Shameless plug. Happy to sign them for you. With this question, I'm also, by the way, around for more questions afterwards, and I'm really easy to find. There's only like one person with my last name that's outside of my family, so I'm easy to find. I come back to the question of cultural gravity. What do I mean by that? And you're going to see my science fiction influence here a little bit. But I really do think that since maybe World War II, but probably before that, much of the way the world has spun has been around the gravitational center that is the West. Politically, the United Nations, a variety of institutions that we set up around the world. Economically, the United States has been a major force, but also other Western economic powers. But also culturally, the United States' greatest export has long been our media, in the sense that it's a form of soft power. We want to spread a set of ideas, a way of seeing the world that is Western, that is based on the way we understand it. And that has created a gravitational field that a lot of countries, as they modernize, they will fall into our orbit. What's so exciting about this young generation for me is China is so economically and politically consequential that we have to care about what they want their culture to be like. Because for the first time, there's something with enough gravitational pull that they're going to start affecting the way that our world spins. So whether we want to pay attention or not, having the amount of force, different than Japan, Korea, the tiger economies, which have become rich without impacting us dramatically. China is going to be different. And this young generation, I think how they will change the world is that they will change the world. The fine points of what that means for our economy, I think, are still being ironed out. But this generation does not just want to become like American millennials, but just kind of over there with different haircuts. That's not their aspiration, and that's not how it's going to play out.
Thank you.